May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. This gospel that we just heard, two things kind of come through loud and clear if you didn't notice. Pruning and connection. Pruning and connection. These two are essential, Jesus says, for a life that will bear fruit. So I want to talk about both of these, pruning and connection. But first, what does it mean to have a life that bears fruit? And this is of course a metaphor, so it can probably mean an infinite number of things. But when I hear about this life that bears fruit, I think that doesn't mean lives that have been simply productive. Lives that have been kind of caught up in the cogs, the machine, and cranked out widgets for a society, that craves widgets, and you've been productive. That is not just what Jesus means by a life that bears fruit. A life that bears fruit is a lot more. A life that bears fruit in John's gospel is always kind of associated with what he calls abundant life. And that means abundant life for us and for all. So bearing fruit is a life that gives food to a starving world. Bearing fruit is a life of generosity, of service, of creativity. Bearing fruit means a life that is filled with the fruit juice of love. Love for our family, for our neighbors, love for life itself. And so Jesus says, if we are going to bear fruit, it's all about pruning and it's about connection. So first, connection. Jesus says, I am the vine. And I guess you can kind of think of stalk or trunk. And we are the branches. And this is a great metaphor, I think, to play with. We know that the vine, the trunk, brings the nutrients out of the ground. Up out of that ground of being, as Paul Tillich calls it. And so the vine gives that sap of life to the branches, us. And then we bear fruit. And so this means that we bear fruit not because we're kind of squeezing it out of ourselves. It means we bear fruit because we are extensions of the vine. Jesus says, the vine abides in the branches, and the branches abide in the vine, and it's all one. I once heard a kind of a similar metaphor used. I heard this from a priest named Jim Abbott. I think he read it somewhere, but he used this image of a spring, like a water spring in the ground, a water source. And so that bubbles up, and then out of that you kind of get a creek, or a stream flowing from that spring. And the creek cannot exist if it's not connected to the source. And the creek carries that life-giving water out into the world. If we are going to give that life-giving water, we have to stay connected to the source. And in this, one of the things that this metaphor of the vine that Jesus uses, one thing that lends itself to, though, is this kind of notion that as branches, we are connected to all the other branches through the vine. When we're connected to the vine, we are not apart from each other. I mean, think about that, right? Look around this room as we gather here today. We are not here because we all have the same political or philosophical views. We are here because of our connection to the vine. We are here because we are thirsty for that life-giving sap that the vine brings from the source. And so one thing that is kind of inherent in this teaching of Jesus, his teaching on the vine, is to say that there is no way to abide in the vine independently, apart from the other branches. We are all connected to the vine. And so the branches are connected to each other. But the problem is so often in the world this kind of goes wrong, right? There's mistrust. The branches don't trust one another. The branches compete with one another. And we forget that we are all part of the one vine, one life, one love. I once heard another agricultural story, I guess. This is about a man who is a corn farmer out Midwest. And he grew really good corn. And every year he would enter his corn into the state fair. And just about every year he would win. First prize, the blue ribbon. He was like, I guess, a corn champion. So after one of his winning streaks, after a few years, a newspaper reporter finally got a hold of him and got a secret out of him. How do you grow the best corn year after year? And his answer was kind of simple. He said, I share my seed corn with my neighbors. And the reporter asked him, how can you afford to share your award-winning seed corn with your neighbors every year when they're kind of entering the same competition that you are? And he said, pollination. He said, think about it. He said, the wind picks up the pollen from my neighbor's corn, and that lands on my corn. And if my neighbors are kind of growing inferior corn, over time, that will degrade my corn crop. He said, if I want to grow good corn, I have to help my neighbors grow good corn. We are all connected. If we want to grow good corn or to bear good fruit in our lives, we have to stay connected. Connected to the vine, connected to one another, connected to God through Jesus Christ. And if we don't stay connected, just by kind of simple logic, that means if we're not connected, we are apart. We are cut off. And our gospel today, it calls that pruning. We are pruned. So one way I think this gospel would have been heard in those long ago days, originally to those first hearers, they would have heard this kind of on a corporate level. So members of John's community in the early church who were part of the community but were not contributing or not participating or who were not bearing fruit would have probably inevitably just drifted away. They would have left. We know this. Or perhaps the first listeners in that early community, those early Christians, these were predominantly Jewish Christians. They might have heard this as maybe parts of the religion that needed to be pruned. like the old teachings or old laws or things that kind of no longer made sense and had drifted away, departed from the source doctrine of love your neighbor, love your God. These things they thought might have needed to be pruned. And so Jesus, his followers came along and did some pruning. And so I think this kind of reminds us that the church, the institution, is a living organism. And it is called to bear fruit. And so it is occasionally in need of some pruning, or what we sometimes call reforming. So we can kind of see how this teaching works on a larger corporate institutional level, but it also works, I think, on a very deeply personal level. If our lives are going to bear fruit, we have to stay connected to the source, and we have to occasionally be pruned. There are things in our lives that just do not serve us well, and they need to go. And sometimes we know, like exactly what that is. Like, oh, I gotta knock that off. Sometimes we don't know what these things are until they're revealed. And so we ask God and we trust God to be the vine grower and to help us prune away those habits, those ways, those thought patterns, those addictions, whatever, so that we can become better and truer versions of ourselves. And sometimes, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, that pruning can be a little painful. From the plant's perspective, I guess, sometimes it hurts. And we're not exactly sure what the vine grower is up to. I mean, that seems to be true in my life. But one thing to remember is that this is only a metaphor, and it's not, no metaphor completely explains our experience or our reality. And so with this metaphor, I like to remember that there's a big difference between a master gardener and like a Boy Scout with a hatchet running around in the woods, right? I was one, so. God is a master gardener. God is careful. And so pruning happens gently, intentionally, with skilled hands to trim away the dead or the unused or the old branches to increase growth. We need to be pruned. Our lives need pruning. Our institutions need pruning so that new life, new growth, Easter, and resurrection can happen. We need to stay connected to the source, to that which brings up that sap of life to us. So I'm going to close with the words of Jesus. So let's hear these afresh. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. those who abide in me and I in them, bear much fruit. This is the gospel good news.